Hey, this is Jen. A quick thought. I've spoken before, I think multiple times about 1984, George Orwell's book, and he understood a lot about how cult control works, especially in political cult organizations, because of experiences that he had uh, in having Stalinism take over the socialist groups that he believed in, and having been a police officer in Burma and seeing the cruelty that developed because of cult mentality, among other things. He had a pretty amazing life, even though it was cut short uh, by illness when he was about 50. Very wise man. In any case, in 1984, the characters who start to wake up, and I've spoken about this before, are reeled in by kind of this false opposition and are taught the control mechanisms that are used by the cult of Ingsoc, the political group that is controlling this future version of England. And it's interesting because whereas before they started waking up, they were kept ignorant of the control mechanisms as much as possible. But once they started waking up, the cult decided to show them these control mechanisms before reeling them back in. And I had some other thoughts before about it, which I think are still valid, but the thought occurred to me today, and this may seem a bit redundant, but in a cult, the deeper you get, the more you understand the control mechanisms, but also because you're desensitized, the deeper you get, because you have more and more delusional trust in the leaders and in the doctrines, you don't care about those control mechanisms as much. And because you understand them to a degree, you start to believe, well, they don't bother you anymore. So I think that part of what Orwell was showing in 1984 by having the characters be taught these control mechanisms before being reeled back in, I think that was part of creating a stronger mental cage for them, so that after they were reeled back in, if they thought about the control mechanisms, they felt like they had already gone past that, had already made peace with it, had already decided that those were necessary and good, so that when they thought about those control mechanisms, they were less likely to wake up again and rebel. So I thought that was an interesting dynamic. I experienced that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which you'll notice I kind of hesitated to even say the name of it, an aside here, because I've still got family in it and loved ones in it, and it's extremely discouraged for people to listen to those who would speak against the church or criticize it or accuse it of being a cult or having these control mechanisms. They call it anti. Don't listen to anti. And also not to associate with people who uh, criticize the church or have anti. In fact, you've seen that the temples in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and you know formerly known as Mormons. Um, and in order to get to the temple, to go inside there and to uh, have these ceremonies that are supposed to give you eternal life and allow you to be with your family afterward. You are told, as part of the requirements before getting in, and they interview you, uh, they ask you if you have any sympathies with people who are opposed to the church or its teachings or who criticize it. And you're not allowed in if you're listening to people like me. And there's a strong social stigma against people, who are considered apostate, who have left. There's nothing a cult hates more than an apostate. I've been fortunate enough that my family who is still in the church has tried to maintain a relationship with me. It gets tense sometimes, but we love each other and we're trying to maintain those relationships. But I'm worried about endangering those relationships by speaking out because of what the cult does to people. And it's kind of ridiculous that we're, even after I've left the church, and many people after having left the church are still afraid to speak about what happened because our relationships are held hostage to it. If you're speaking anti, there's plenty of scripture and words from the leaders that say that you're supposed to basically shun people like me. I've been fortunate enough that my family hasn't done that so much, even though they know that I'm doing this. They don't listen to it. They don't like to think about it. They get mad at me when I talk about it. I've had people scream at me. I've had people call me names from the scriptures that are supposed to be evil people from the scriptures, and because they've been so trained to hate criticism and be so averse to criticism. And what an effective and diabolical trap that is, of when there's problems, you're not supposed to talk about them or listen to people who talk about them, so that you can't see the untruth of it all or see the abuse of it all. They say that you can question, but it's not really questioning in a real sense, because you are expected to come to the conclusion that the teachings are true and to become even more committed and obedient through your questioning. And you're supposed to do mental gymnastics to lead you back to submission to the leaders and to the church. And if you come to conclusions in your questioning that lead you away from it, they'll say that that's Satan, and if you leave, again, this cycle of being called apostate. So I'm scared to talk about it, because of fear of that social rejection from my family. So frequently I won't talk or say that it was Mormonism, but instead I'll say the cult that I grew up in, and kind of describe it so as not to upset them by defaming the church per se, but talking about principles. I tell you what, it's hard. It's a difficult predicament and conundrum, and I haven't figured out how to handle it exactly yet. I think there's better ways than what I figured out so far, but this is what I figured out so far. Anyways, back to 1984. I rambled there for a minute. But again, this idea of the deeper you get, the more you know that you guys are manipulating people, but you also think it's for the greater good. The thing I'm a little bit I disagree a little bit with Orwell. Well, actually, no, no. Most of what I will say is, in his book, these people who were uh, is Winston and what's her name? I forget her name because it's been a while. Um, they leave loyalty to Ingsoc together, and they decide to join the resistance. But it turns out the resistance is a controlled opposition and is actually run by the bad guys who they thought that they had escaped, which I mentioned before. And once they've figured out all these things and the control mechanisms, then the bad guys reveal themselves and capture them and take them to this torture room and torture them until they uh, tell Ingsoc, tell these torturers whatever they want to hear, but they don't just tell a lie. They torture them until they say it and believe it. That's something that uh, has happened, at least according to historians and people who have observed these things in particularly China and the Soviet Union under those totalitarian regimes. Um, but something that Robert J. Lifton discovered when he was studying uh, the Chinese brainwashing was that even though they were using torture, it didn't take torture to brainwash people. It took social conditions that uh, instead traumatized them with stories and with the tribal cohesion instinct. And that warps our reality. That our strongest instinct is for connection and for sticking with our tribe. Sorry for the long pause there. Just thinking. Um, and our minds are designed to use our cognitive capacities within the context of survival and survival of the population and supporting the cult, or well, our social population. And if there are any realities that are inconvenient to that, or uh, recognizing abuse that if we fully realized it and fully felt the gravity of it, instead of being numb to it, we would probably leave. Um, the human instinct is to uh, ignore those sorts of things or have faith that they'll be understood at a later date, and especially to have this situation of reality warp around us so that we perceive, because of these shifts in our minds for these delusions that are created for survival, we don't perceive the abuse, and we even perceive the abuse as a positive and as helping us. And we see the leaders as these great heroes who are frequently, will they'll treat them as infallible, but they'll say that they're fallible human beings. It's kind of like this bait and switch. Um, we're taught and they covenant not to, quote unquote, speak ill of the Lord's anointed. Even if they're doing terrible things, you're not supposed to talk about it. Which should have been a huge red flag. But again, by the time you get to that point, you're pretty well indoctrinated and numb and don't appreciate the gravity of that and how bad it is and how abusive that is. So, that's the quick thought on 1984. They were taught the abuse and control mechanisms and then reeled back into the group, in that case by torture, but again, usually it's through social conditions that don't necessarily imply having physical harm done to them. It's psychological harm, but frequently designed to feel good, or uh, maybe you're taught to be afraid of not being pure to according to the group's standards, that these purity ideas are impossible, and then because you have quote unquote sinned, you are dependent on the group for healing from that sin, for having that sin removed, so that you can, uh, in the case of the in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I say that whole thing because currently, and this isn't the way that it was while I was growing up, they consider Mormon to be a slur, which is where it started out, but they started using it themselves, and it wasn't for most of the church's history. But uh, there was one church prophet leader who that was a kind of his personal axe to grind, and so they got rid of that word, and that 2-syllable word, and now you have to say a 7-syllable word, um, or some other more manipulative words. I'll probably cover that at a different time. I'll try to be brave and share the story, and hope that these relationships hold out, and that they understand that I'm telling my story as I've experienced it. Yeah. So that's it for today. Um, remember to be kind to everyone, but also especially to cult members, because they're taught that the outside world is scary, and that other people are unenlightened, or evil, or these different things. And if we mistreat them, it's not going to wake them up, but rather it's going to drive them deeper in, because we kind of prove what they've been told, that the outside world is bad and scary. And they're in a toxic and harmful environment. And what needs to be done is for us to provide uh, an off ramp into a safe environment, and a non-toxic environment, and an accepting environment where they are allowed to think for themselves and not be abused or controlled, and allowed to heal. Um, it's easy to have the instinct to try to hurt people who are maybe doing harm because they're in a cult, but that doesn't help. Doesn't help them wake up. And that's played out again and again in different cult members waking up stories, and that's what all the experts say. So be kind to everyone, but especially to cult members. Don't feed into the persecution complex. Create a safe social environment for them to escape to when they are ready. All right, that's it.